I feel tremendously sorry for the people of Crowborough. I was speaking earlier on to former Labour Special Advisor Paul Richards, who said, and he couldn't really flesh this out, to be honest, with detail, but he was sort of making this suggestion that army barracks are preferable to hotels because you can enforce the borders, ironically, of army barracks. And when I said to him, well, how's that going to be done, the policing of this, does that mean they're not going to be allowed out and about? He's like, oh no, of course they're going to be allowed out and about. They need fresh air. They'll be, all these young men will go tonto if you lock them all up together. And I'm thinking, well, that's the point, isn't it? All these young men could well go tonto out and about on the streets as well. Do you think that we're about to, one of the callers that I had today was talking to me about vigilantes on social media, sort of saying they're going to go over to France and start taking matters into their own hands. Do you think that 2026 could become a year where essentially the public go, we've had enough, that we actually reach breaking point?
What's really being said here is not about barracks or hotels. It's about authority. The public feels that rules exist, but no one enforces them. When people start talking about vigilantes, that's not extremism. It's a warning sign of institutional failure. When the state looks weak, social trust collapses. That is the emotional backdrop driving this entire conversation.
Really interesting question, Alex. I mean, there's no doubt that in 2025, the public's had enough. It's just difficult for the public to know what to do, what levers to pull, how to cast their ballot papers in order to try and solve this problem. They've voted for the Conservatives over and over again, who said we cap immigration at tens of thousands. Well, that didn't work. Voted in the Labour Party, who said they were going to smash the gangs. That patently hasn't worked. So I don't want to encourage vigilantism or anything against the law. Of course not, but you can understand the incredible frustration that it just doesn't seem anyone in government is capable or perhaps even willing to grasp this problem. And I've seen some of the statements today from the Labour government around this barracks and the wider issue, that there's no silver bullet, they say. Well, actually, there's quite a few silver bullets, actually, quite a few, or if not silver bullets, at least a whole armoury of bronze bullets that you could fire. We've got to radically shorten the asylum process. So the presumption is we're saying no to an asylum seeker unless they adduce enormous evidence to persuade us beyond reasonable doubt that they have a proper asylum claim, and the burden should be on them. We need to get those decisions down from 18 months to about 18 days, I would suggest, to reach a verdict, limit the rights of appeal, pull ourselves out of any international treaties or obligations that we have that might stand in the way of that. So we need to end lawfare. We need a less generous settlement. We should be utterly humane, of course, but we need a less generous settlement to those who are waiting for their applications to be processed than we have at the moment. 4-star hotels in Canary Wharf should not be on the menu. To that extent, you might argue a military barracks is a bit more of a deterrent. But these people are often coming from sleeping under a tree in Calais. So it's not obvious to me that you need to provide them with an enormous amount more than that.
There's someone in a WhatsApp group that I'm in who has great in-depth knowledge of the standards of accommodation at military barracks in her neck of the woods. And she was basically saying, my gosh, they've got everything. They have visiting entertainers. They have this, they have that. They have karaoke nights. She was basically suggesting it sounds like Butlins rather than barracks.
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of part of the problem, isn't it? That although they're not terribly expensive necessarily in terms of total government expenditure, all the bells and whistles that seem to be added, and only when they're publicly exposed does the government get on top of them. High-end dentistry that's beyond the capabilities of most of the British population provided for asylum seekers. Stories of, video games being provided, all of the rest of it, yoga classes, Pilates lessons, all of the sort of things that regular Brits have to pay for themselves. And these are only stamped down on when the light of publicity is shone upon them. So the system is completely and utterly out of control at the moment. And I think it sounds perhaps a little bit inhuman to use these sort of rather brutal terms, but I think we've got to look at the problem in two different ways. There's a stock problem. That's to say,
politically, this exposes the real divide, not left versus right, but voters versus a system that refuses to make hard decisions. The argument here is simple. Delays create chaos, generosity without limits creates pull factors, and secrecy fuels resentment. When ordinary citizens struggle to afford basics while seeing extensive support elsewhere, legitimacy erodes. That is how trust in institutions dies.
The people who are already here, some of whom need to be, removed because they're illegally melded in with the population, others who are pending and waiting for their application to be processed. Whole bunch of people, perhaps a million or more people in Britain illegally. That's a problem of stock. And then there's a flow problem of the number of people coming over the channel each year or getting into the United Kingdom by other routes. And we seem at the moment completely incapable of solving either. I think you've got to be very, very clear on the flow. That then makes the stock less of an issue. I mean, it's ludicrous that we need 40,000 or more hotel places while we're processing applications. The system has got utterly and completely out of control. So we need to be harsher without being inhumane. We need to stop the pull factor that makes it so unbelievably attractive for people to get here. And part of that, a big part of that, is if they calculate the odds of the likelihood that they can stay or just disappear into the system, once they've rationally calculated their odds, why not get on a small boat and pull the lever and see whether you win?
Would it not serve as a deterrent if, when people were put in army barracks, they weren't allowed off-site? At the very least, they should face a curfew. We should know where they are and where they're going, and everyone, the amount of people who just disappear from these hotels, it's at least, I've heard from someone inside it, it's at least one a day is just disappearing into the ether. Why on earth are we not saying, right, you've got food, you got shelter, but you ain't leaving this site. Here's a playing field. You can go and kick a football around in, but actually, otherwise, that's all you're getting, because it seems to me that would sort of travel quite quickly. News of a lack of freedom would probably run amok on the social media sites, and you might suddenly find demand starts to drop. I don't understand why the government don't take that particular measure. And when I was brought up, we were in a sort of 1970s housing estate, but it was the final frontier before the countryside. So my brother and I used to go on really long bike rides. It was basically, our little suburb on the outskirts of Gloucester, and then nothing. And now it's astonishing. They basically live in the middle of a housing estate because they've built even more housing estates. And I was going to see my parents at the weekend. I was driving down the road. I was like, oh my goodness, they're even building on the fields just over the road. It's crazy.
This is the political danger point. When policies are imposed without consent, communities stop believing promises. The issue isn't compassion versus cruelty, it's credibility. If governments cannot show limits, timelines, and enforcement, voters conclude the system works only for insiders. That perception reshapes elections, fractures parties, and fuels long-term instability. This moment matters because once trust is lost, it is brutally hard to rebuild.